Oslo, many great nights and days in Oslo as well. A group of us are going to cross Oslo again this November, but we work very well together. We really appreciate their support across the last couple of years, and we're looking forward to overtaking them as the best attraction in Ireland sometime soon when the new museum is revamped. So Mr. Geir Kløver from the Fram Museum.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing us to bringing Amundsen's 150th anniversary here to Ireland. I will ramble through some of the lesser known parts of his expeditions and life, and then in the end discuss his legacy and how it's looked upon today, primarily in Norway, which is unfortunately a bit different view than in the rest of the world. So thank you to Shackleton School, O'Brien's, and the entire community of Athy for welcoming us so warmly every year. We really appreciate it and we enjoy coming. Here's the two photos we have with Amundsen and Shackleton. I don't know the one to the right. I think it's from a film and news footage. I recorded it from television. The other one is during Amundsen's lecture circuit after the South Pole Expedition, where Shackleton and Perry joined Amundsen for 3 or 4 lectures, both in New York and DC, and they partied and had a great time together. So, since we last met, we have gone through some troublesome years, as everyone else. We were forced to close for 1 year, and when we were allowed to open, we could only have 50 people in the museum at the same time, even if there's room for a few thousand. The other smaller shops in the country could pile people in without problem, but not us. So we had less than 60,000 visitors in 2020 and also in 2021, and made a huge loss financially in 2021 without the only symbolic compensation from the government. So we're still in a bit nervous special mode what will happen in the next couple of months. But from August, the visitor numbers have gone back to normal. And for 8 years we've been voted the best museum in Norway on TripAdvisor. And the last 2 years we've been the best attraction in Norway. And normally that goes... go to a viewing point or a fjord, you know. What can you say wrong about the beautiful view, and it's free, you know? So, but this is better. So, Roald Amundsen was born in 1872, on the 16th of July, and there's been a lot of anniversary events, and most of them through the Fram Museum. I'll go briefly through what we have done in this year. We made a large exhibition on his life and expeditions, and that was outside the City Hall in Oslo for a full month, the entire month of July. It's like the busiest pedestrian point in the country. Thousands and thousands passing it every day. And after Oslo, it moved to the old city in Fredrikstad, the town where he was born, and now it's in the Fram Museum and will be there until summer. So coming up and see it, it's there. On 16th of July, we had a huge party in the museum. Of course, everybody was on vacation in the middle of July, but 100 people were coming, including 28 of the Amundsen family, out of like 35. That was great. 3 generations. So we celebrated and had great fun until early morning. On that day, we published a 3-volume work about 1,000 letters that Amundsen wrote through all his life to his brothers. So from him was a young man until the year before he died. So most of these letters has never been seen by any researchers before, but over the last 10 years we have gotten them from family members of his brothers. It's quite an amazing collection. It also includes his very private diary written to his kind of girlfriend. So it's a lot of smooching in there, but it tells a lot of his planning and his lecture circuit and an entire lecture tour in the US. We know exactly what he did every single day, who he met, etc., etc. It's a fascinating document. And also tons of photos. Amundsen, he was the youngest of 4 brothers, and so a family of ship owners and sailors, and he wanted to be a polar explorer, inspired by Franklin. His mother forced him to start medical studies. So after 2 years of studies at the University of Oslo, his mother died, and the rest of his life he dedicated to polar exploration. And through all this time, he sent letters to his family from his expedition and lecture circuits, so they're kind of filling in the gaps between his personal diary. It was published an akevit, anniversary akevit, in 1500 bottles, specially made. Akevit is Norwegian potato spirits. Some like it, some don't. The people that like it says that this was a particularly good bottle. So if you come to our anniversary event in November, you are able to taste it. Another exhibition is obviously Clay Amundsen. And it was made for a huge international polar exhibition in Bergen in Norway in 1940. And it was supposed to be a huge number of countries. The entire Bergen will be transformed into polar area with walrus in the lakes in town, etc., etc. And they planned it for 3 years, and an artist, like ceramics artist, made a lot of decorations for this exhibition. Then the war came, and these things were in storage. And they've only been shown briefly in this small city where the Ceramics Museum is, and now for the first time it's shown to a broad public, and it will be until next summer. Here you see some of these pieces, so it's quite hilarious and interesting. 2 weeks ago, a new film with Amundsen was published in Norway, a very expensive Norwegian animation film called Titina, on the expeditions of Amundsen and Norway to the North Pole in the airship Norge, and then the airship Italia that got wrecked 2 years later. I'll show you the English trailer for that film.
Buongiorno. My name is Roald Amundsen.
Yes?
I want to fly to the North Pole.
You want me to build an airship?
Yes,
To fly to the North Pole?
and you must come along.
I see. What? To the North Pole?
It has got amazing reviews in the Norwegian press, and we're not all too happy about this film, making Amundsen a real idiot. And Nobile and his dog, the kind of a hero. But it's a beautiful film, and maybe it attracts people to the museum. So we have made a new exhibition on all of Amundsen's flight that opened the same day as this film premiered, telling the real story about these expeditions. And at the same time, we then published his personal diaries from his flights. It's a 480-page book with 600 photos from all his attempts to fly and reach the North Pole in an airship. And then, for last weekend of November, we had our own little Amundsen autumn-winter school, the Roald Amundsen Memorial Lectures, that take place every year, the last weekend of November. So, amazing event. And then we will publish our book, The Amusing Amundsen. Everybody else taking the neck of Amundsen, we can also do it. And it's mainly done by our designer Storm, who's here. We're taking historical photos, a few hundred photos. In the end of the book, there are the real subtitles to these photos, but they are in very small letters. So all of these activities is done by our crew. There are only 8 people at the Fram Museum, 6 of them are here. Here we see some of them. with Ernest here in the middle. And twice we had little part-time staff, which you might recognize. So if I refer to these letters that we published, in earlier letters, Roald Amundsen describes with huge enthusiasm his first hires and seal hunting in Iceland and Greenland. And in 1896 he was on Jason, the ship that Captain Larsen used for his exploration in Antarctica. He was a man working there. And the following year he sailed to Dakar, writing that very worried about the troublesome heat. The one who was back in the Arctic Ocean, he writes to his brother at the age 23. He's also trying to get search high and low for parrots to give to his brother. Here's his first meeting on the Belgica with Nansen and also Geir and some of the Belgica crew members. This is in Sandefjord when Geir is up to pick up the ship that was later renamed Belgica. He shares his joy in being hired at the Belgian Antarctic Expedition and going to Antwerp, and then his shock when the landlady, where he rented a room, taking her own life by placing several buckets of glowing coal in her bedroom. And he immediately travels home but returns to Belgium before the expedition sails south. Here's the official photo of Amundsen for the Belgica expedition. He was hired as a crew member, but already when they sailed, he was the first mate on board. Here he works as the hairdresser on board. Then Emil Rapovica, the Romanian scientists, being cut. And after the Belgica expedition, he and his brother take their bikes from Oslo, and they use the bike down to Cognac in France, biking all the way. And then he goes to Spain and he joins the family ship Oscar, which you can see here, and go to Pensacola and to do his master's license. Come home from there and he goes directly to Hamburg to study Earth magnetism and buying magnetic instruments for his planned exploration of the Northwest Passage and rediscovering the magnetic North Pole. He then, 1901, travels to Tromsø and purchased the Jura, the ship that he used through the Northwest Passage, and he spent 6 months with the old crew on the Jura to learn all the things about this small ship. Goes to Oslo and holds his lecture 2 years before he goes to the Northwest Passage, where he presents the route that he was planning to take, which is quite interesting that he, on this map, he's planning to sail south of King William Island. And most people then thought King William Island was a peninsula. So he already found out that that would be the safest and possible route through the Northwest Passage. The year after, Clemens Markham from Britain comes and visits the Jura, and David Nansen, they are served champagne, and he managed to get some money for his expedition. And then in 1903, he sails towards the Northwest Passage. There's a lot of lovely ladies up in the Northwest Passage, and many people in Johaven today claims to be the grandchild of Roald Amundsen, including the late Bob Conana. And going through the diaries, it's fairly clear to us that he didn't have sexual relationship with the locals. You know, he's the chief of the Norwegians, like he wouldn't pay a match to have sex with the ladies. He wanted to have his status. But when you read the diaries, there are 2 other candidates that could be grandfather of both and others, and those were the 2 married men on the expedition. And we have done DNA of all these people that say they are related, and it's 100% sure that they are not related to others. So, but we haven't checked the DNA of the other families. Sailed to Northwest Passage and is received in San Francisco, and as you can see, just after the earthquake, San Francisco is flattened, but the celebration was immense. The whole town stood up and compared Amundsen to Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, a after 400 years, the Northwest Passage is finally been sailed through. And during his lecture tour, he meets up with his old childhood friend, Herman Gade, a Norwegian diplomat. And that became kind of his haven the next 20 years, going to Chicago, spending time with his friend there, going to lively gentlemen's club and having a good time. And also in London, was also the same places he went to when he didn't want to be recognized and wanted peace and quiet. He's planning the South Pole Expedition, or actually at that time, the North Pole Expedition. And then it was announced that Amundsen is also going to the South Pole. And then this huge amount of writings, almost daily and weekly, both in press in Norway and the UK, about the rivalry and the upcoming race, etc. And here's some of these cartoons. Here is Norwegian press that when Shackleton had come 97 miles from the pole, he says, "Don't cry, little Roald. Your goal is the North Pole." And here's Shackleton is praised as the new Southern Light. And Scott writes, "Shackleton has chosen an excellent route." And Amundsen comforts Nansen and explorer Sverdrup that he did not reach the pole either, as neither Nansen or Sverdrup did. Here's Scott with horse and Amundsen with dogs. Here the Japanese are also included, because also the Japanese expedition and the German expedition was planning to go to the pole. It's another one, horse and dogs. This is an interesting one. 8th of April 1910, even before any of them go to Antarctica. And it's captured. It was published 8th of April 1910. It says at the South Pole in 1912. And Scott finally reached the South Pole. Amundsen is riding a merry-go-round and having a great time. And of course, all polar explorers were asking to give their opinion. Mawson, Borchgrevink, Shackleton, etc., who will get there first, analysis of the different expedition. Shackleton's first impression after reading the news is that the Fram cannot handle the southern seas. It's made for Arctic waters. He said Terranova is a much better ship. And he says that Amundsen don't have enough people and not enough dogs to make it efficiently to the South Pole. Mawson is criticizing Scott for dropping people off at Cape Adare, which was his planned place for his expedition. And of course, polar etiquette. Are they too close? Scott and Amundsen. Is Amundsen breaking the etiquette by going to Antarctica at the same time as Scott? Of course, that never, the Japanese and the Germans was never criticized for that, just the Norwegians. Here's another one for Captain Davis, commander of Nimrod. He writes that about Amundsen, that he's such a leader of men that no difficulties in the world would make him turn back. He goes to the South Pole and back, and then the Fram goes to Buenos Aires and start planning for the North Pole expedition. Amundsen goes to Hacienda to write his book, they say. He only stayed there for 2 weeks. I don't think the book was entirely written during that time. Well, the men goes home for a break, a year break, before the North Pole expedition to start. And we found a souvenir passenger list and program from this trip back to Norway, where they must have a lot of fun. Bjørland wanted cockfighting. Prestrud, the potato race, the gentleman class. 2 Norwegians were number 1 and 2 in spar boxing. Total war, Fram crew members, Peter Feynman. And Lieutenant Gjertsen won slinging the monkey. So what is slinging the monkey? And I tried to Google it. Are there people below 18 here? sexual position in which the female is getting pounded doggy style, while the male grabs the tits and the female tickles the man's balls whilst French kissing. So, I don't know what happened on cruise ship in those days, but obviously Action is the expert. Then Amundsen cruised and did lectures in Europe and North America. Fram is made ready to go to the North Pole and be the first ship through the Panama Canal. Canal doesn't finish, so Amundsen ordered the ship to go around South America up to San Francisco. On their way back, a crew member dies of an illness, and Fram is ordered back to Norway, where she's put into permanent, well, she's not used anymore, and here you can see Fram to the left, and his new ship, Maud, taking the masts and other important equipment from the Fram and used on the Maud. Then, of course, the news come about what happened to the Scott expedition, and Amundsen writes in his letter to his brother that it's really sad, not unexpected, and asks his brother to send condolences both to family and the British government. He also sent a letter to Kathleen Scott offering to send a painting of Scott's Nunatak, the mountain that Amundsen and his men explored while in Antarctica. Here's the photo on the top of Scott's Nunatak. Amundsen, the route 100-day plan for lecture in America, and there we can see we get well in with the American people. That's 2 sledges that returned from the Norwegians from the South Pole Expedition, and one of them was given to American Museum of Natural History to establish a bond. So this is equipment, and the only other sledge is in Norway. So I think I've seen many South Pole sledges in Norway, and through the letters we know that there's actually only one in our country. This is photos from the area in Northwest Passage, King William Land, and as you see it's quite barren and flat. And for Amundsen it was a problem that when you navigate through these areas and you can only get as high up as the masts. You can't see very much from a mast of 30 meters, and especially with the ice, and if you're able to get high enough up and you see open areas, it can save the drift time for up to a year or maybe 2 years if you know where the open water is. So you're kind of starting to study, and the planes at that time in 1909, before Blériot crossed the English Channel, was not very good and didn't reach very far. So he did research on man-lifting kites, and this is the one that they made, consisting of 7, 8 different kites together that could carry 300 kilos. And they went up there up to 600 meters with this, in a 1,000-meter steel wire. And during the research, lightning hit, and the captain of the Fram, Ole Engelstad, was instantly killed. So they hired a new captain and continued the research on the kites. Here you see 2 of the crew members in the kite, and there's Amundsen on the way up. And they brought this equipment for the South Pole Expedition. But of course they didn't use it, they didn't need it going into the South Pole. But the 1,000-meter wire they used to tie up all the 116 dogs outside of Framheim, as you can see on this photo. On his lecture tour, he went to San Francisco, 25th of March, and then he's doing his first flight. He's joining a Norwegian-American, Silas Christofferson, on a Christofferson flying boat. And there's Amundsen behind the wheel, and he got really infatuated with planes. And soon as he got home to Norway, he went on a long private flight between Oslo and Lillehammer, and getting home from there he started his practice, and here he's taking his license, pilot's license, and that's the first international pilot license taken in Norway. So this is, as you can see, pilot license number 1. But the There's no evidence that he actually flew after that, but he spent the rest of his life flying. He's buying a plane in New York for the Maud expedition, and they're trying to fly it to Seattle. This is what happened when they're flying. So the plane crashed. The pilot and him lived. They bought a new plane, and they sent 2 planes on the Maud expedition. One of these, which they thought could travel from Alaska to Svalbard, but it was fragile. After the first test, they broke the landing gear, so it didn't work out. And the other plane was used for a few missions around Maud to check the ice conditions around Maud to see where the open waters were. But they were not expert pilots either, so after a couple of short trips, that plane was also crashed. So we spent the next few years trying to find suitable planes to fly to the North Pole, and they ended up with 2 German Dornier-Wahl planes made in Italy because of, after the First World War, the Germans weren't allowed to make military equipment. And we had 6 crew members, and they started to fly, and as they lift up, the N-24 got ripped underneath. And with a flying boat, that's not a good thing if you're landing on water. But anyway, they just kept flying and following Amundsen, who was in N-25. Some images from there. And after they're reaching almost 88 degrees, because as Kevin told you, that's quite close to the North Pole. And then they landed because they needed proper navigation. And they got, because that nice open channel in the water was not nice and open for very long, so they got stuck. And they had to prepare a runway. They spent weeks digging with a knife, a bayonet, a wooden shovel. Thousands of tons of snow and ice was trapped and stamped on. And after 3.5 weeks, they said, now we have to go, because we don't have that much food left, and if we don't manage to get up in the air, we have to start walking southwards. But they managed to get up and return to Norway after almost 4 weeks. And for the Norwegians, this was Amundsen returning from death. And when you come to Oslo, that's probably the biggest event of his welcoming in his entire life in 1925. Well, while they were up there in the ice, they didn't give up going to the North Pole, and they found out that an airship must be a much better thing, because then you can refill and repair while you're still in the air. You don't have to land. It was the completely safest thing. So they went to Italy and bought an airship and fixed it so it was a bit more sturdy, 106 meter long, 28 meter high, so quite massive, like a football field, traveling from Italy and up towards the North Pole. But I mean, it had to be a huge hangar during the winter up at Svalbard. It's a huge effort, and raise masts at different places, because that's the only way you could anchor this airship is through these masts. Here you have the leaving from Italy outside London in Fulham. They stopped at the mast there, and then they come to Oslo, and then up to New Ålesund, Kings Bay at Svalbard, and then they depart for the North Pole. They drop Norwegian, American, Italian flag at the North Pole, and after 3.5 days they're landing in Alaska. So he's then becoming the first man to the North Pole as well, even if they did not land. In the film Titina, Amundsen didn't have a clue where the North Pole was, so he needed help from Roberto Nobile to find it. And he's returning home, and then says to the world that now I'm finished with polar exploration, now someone else has taken over. Now I've been on 6 major expeditions in Arctic and Antarctica, and charted thousands and thousands of miles. And 2 years later, the American Isles and Australian Wilkins became the first people to fly from Alaska to Svalbard. And they're celebrated at Amundsen's home. Here you see Trygve Gran from Scott Expedition, Otto Sverdrup, Amundsen, Iles and Wilkins, and during the lunch, and celebratory lunch for this expedition, which gathered a lot of surviving Norwegian polar explorers, the news about Nobilis crash. He went to the North Pole in the airship Italia, and they gone missing, and Amundsen is asked if he would help search, and he says right away, but the Norwegian government didn't want him part of the search organization, so the French government gave him a plane and a pilot and a crew, a LATAM 47, which travels from France to Bergen, and from Bergen to Tromsø. And then when they depart Tromsø for Svalbard to search, Amundsen is never seen again. And recently, film footage, the last film footage of Amundsen was uncovered in the National Library and digitized. So this is the last 2 minutes of film that was ever taken of Roald Amundsen. It's in Bergen before flying to Tromsø. As the French crew members, the famous polar explorer's last journey. Stop for a second here. A pontoon under the wing has been found. So obviously they have landed, the pontoon has been fallen off. That's the second part they found is a gas tank that obviously have been trying to be made into a pontoon to put under the wing. So we know they landed, we know that this was destroyed, and we know that they have tried to fix the plane, but the plane has not been found. We don't know where they are. Some say that Lincoln Ellsworth, his friend from the flights, it was all planned. And as Geir would say, that they came and picked him up and he lived in Mexico for the rest of his life. I'm not sure, but it's a good story. That could be a great film. So that's the last photo that was taken of Amundsen before he starts off from Tromsø and towards the north. So, if beings from other planets land in southern Norway, they'll probably wonder who Roald Amundsen was. There's so many street names, monuments, buildings where he's honored and that bears his name. You have all these museums that celebrate Amundsen's life and expeditions, all these monuments. Many photos here taken from Rob Stevenson's website. Sorry. And the first film about Amundsen with James Bond himself playing Roald Amundsen, you know, it couldn't be better than that. And then you start looking into some of the literature published in Norway about Roald Amundsen. Some of the latest books, they will wonder why this man is celebrated at all. In these two books, a young Roald Amundsen is in a novel, beat up young people that looks at him just by passing. And in the book series Norway's National Heritage, the writer writes almost throughout the entire book without giving Amundsen any single positive character traits or success. The most famous book about Amundsen by Roald Amundsen calls the internationally very important expedition through the Northwest Passage a giant drunken party, and the film based on the book makes you feel embarrassed that such a person has ever lived. 3 very good international television celebrates Amundsen's life and career, they're really good, but the 2 Norwegian films make him into not a very positive character at all. Both the Amundsen film from 2019 and the new Titina film is very negative in describing Amundsen. They show that he has many character flaws and lacks abilities. I think it's a miracle that he could put on his socks every morning based on those descriptions. And in this wonderful documentary about the Northwest Passage by a Canadian company, and they celebrate both Franklin and celebrate Amundsen. There's one Norwegian expert, and the only thing he says is, "The first person he failed was his mother." And here's a book, 2 books by Ragnar Kvam, which also they are the most read Norwegian polar biographies. They sold a lot, and they kind of say that without Hjalmar Johansen, neither Nansen or Amundsen would have accomplished anything. And he concludes also, leadership-wise, that Amundsen is by far the worst leader if you compare it with Scott Shackleton and Scott and Nansen. So it seems that many of those who portray Roald Amundsen wants to find faults in Amundsen's life and work, amplify, exaggerate, and interpret his weak points based on today's norms, and at the same time hide his wonderful achievements over 30 years. In comparison, the vast majority of books, articles, and documentaries about Nansen, Sverdrup, and a whole series of so-called unknown polar explorers are full of admiration and significant historically important information about weaknesses and blemishes barely mentioned, if it's mentioned at all. Amundsen even slaughtered his dogs and ate it. This is repeated and highlighted as separate themes in articles and TV documentaries. It's even been the subject of a peer-reviewed article in Polar Record and several Norwegian and newspaper articles. None of these authors have read the diaries of Amundsen and his men, where their love for the dogs and the gratitude for the effort the dogs put in on the way to and from the South Pole are described. And here it's quite interesting to note that Amundsen's inspirations for using dogs in that way were Fridtjof Nansen and Robert Peary. They all planned in detail how long each dog could last, how much dog food they could bring, how far they could get when dogs were fed to other dogs. Neither, not a negative word can you find in polar literature about Nansen and Peary on slaughtering and feeding dogs. It's only Roald Amundsen who has fallen victim to this kind of criticism for a practice that was actually quite common in the polar history. So this skewed and rather erroneous presentation of Roald Amundsen has gradually become a mission for me and the Fram Museum. Our studies and our publication of the polar explorer's personal diaries tells a different story, and at the same time show that the diaries from the cruise of Nansen and Sverdrup contain far more engraved description of Nansen and Sverdrup as leaders and individuals than the diaries of Amundsen cruise. Even so, this is overlooked by most biographers. The diaries have of course been not so easily accessible to the reading public, in addition to the fact that handwriting is often very difficult to read. So there has been room for these authors and biographers' creative license and selective dissemination of facts. So we at the Fram Museum try to do our best to tell the actual stories about Amundsen, Nansen, and the other Norwegian polar explorers, and make important first-hand source material available to everyone, and hope that in this way it will become more difficult to falsify history, making up stories when the real stories are much better than the ones they tell, and that is incomprehensible to us. No one is flawless in this work, of course. Less pleasant details about Amundsen and Nansen and documentation of bad decisions also come to light. But who don't make these mistakes? Our icons did it too. But through our publications, each individual can assess whether these are more important than the polar explorers' other contributions to history and society in general. So this is our published account from Amundsen's expeditions. Both crew members, South Pole Expeditions, we have published the diaries of 15 of the 19 men, etc. In addition to our work, we have documented Amundsen's life and expedition by preserving the polar ship Geir. It took 6 years and cost 11 million euros for its own building and restore the ship. That included contribution from both the public and business sectors, but the museum itself was the largest contributor through our own funds and loans. There's this quote shown earlier today, the original quote from Apsley Sherry Gerard in the worst journal in the world. Of course, it's great for a Shackletonian, but when you read the original quote about Amundsen, it says, "For a dash to the pole and nothing else." So that is quite interesting to us, and of course is part of the British description of Amundsen at the time, so we can live with that. But the big villain in the end of Roald Amundsen's life was perhaps the publisher of his book, My Life as an Explorer. They should not allow the book to be published as it is, as it's a bitter pill to end a great international career. Here Amundsen takes issue with everyone he believed failed him and exploited his status for their own gain. So it's also quite annoying that it's just being printed and is for free and is available for everyone to read. I think that was a very quick way for the publisher to earn money. Roald Amundsen was the world's most successful polar explorer, and perhaps the only one who was truly professional and had polar research as his profession. For most others, it was a coincidence and external events that ensured they ended up in the polar regions. For Roald Amundsen, it was his entire life. So even today, he should be an inspiration for many. He was a unique project manager with a modern and individual-based leadership style that we not see similar until the 1980s. His expeditions lived in harmony with nature, and he came closer to northern regions' indigenous population than few before him. Was a creative pioneer in many areas, both in terms of using new and not commonly used technology and improving and developing equipment that have not worked perfectly in the past. And his ability to set goals and carry them out was completely unique in the heroic age. So I have taken the liberty of editing Sherry Gerard's quotes. And it will be published here for the first time. For a dash to the pole, achieve all your goals and return safely with all your men in great shape. Amundsen.